I said my cabin was just a shack. Then the mining rights sold for $137 million. I want to see who really cared for me, but none of them, and they never saw it coming. Lynn had called me 2 days earlier, her voice softer than I'd heard in years. She told me Benjamin would be away on business for the week, and that I could stay with them until my leg healed. The thought of warmth, of seeing my daughter without the constant shadow of her husband, carried me through the long bus ride and the slippery walk up their street. But when I reached their door, Benjamin was already there, leaning in the frame, eyes cold, as if he'd been waiting just to turn me away. Before I could even set my bag down, Benjamin's voice cut through the winter air. "We do not take in cripples here. Go back to your rotting shack. At least the rusty nails there do not complain." Benjamin's voice sliced through the winter air like a knife, each word sharp, deliberate, and meant to wound. He leaned against the doorframe as though he owned not just the house, but the ground under my feet. His lips curled into a smirk, the kind that told me he wanted me to remember every syllable long after I left. Lynn stood just behind him, arms folded tight across her chest, her sweater sleeves bunched at her elbows. "Mother," she said without stepping closer, her tone as cold as the snow falling between us. "You should understand this is not a place for people with no future to be taken in." No one moved to open the door wider. No one reached for my coat or asked me to come inside. Snowflakes clung to my hair, melting into cold trickles down the back of my neck. But the chill that seeped into me was older, deeper, and had nothing to do with the wind. I shifted my weight on the wooden crutch, the rubber tip slipping slightly on the icy porch. My right hip throbbed from the break I had suffered 6 weeks earlier, a constant reminder of the night I slipped on my own cabin steps. I had thought naively that I could accept my daughter's invitation, recover in the warmth of her home, and then return to my life in the Alaskan backcountry. I had not counted on the welcome being colder than the road I'd limped up to get here. "Just until I can manage on my own again," I said, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted. "A couple of months." "I will stay out of the way," Benjamin laughed once, a sharp, humorless sound. "And what then? You will limp back to that pile of timber you call a home? Or will you expect us to keep you until you finally keel over? We are not running a hospice here." Lynn's eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. Hesitation, maybe, or guilt. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "It's not a good time, Mother. We have our own lives to manage. You should be in a place suited to your needs." A place suited to my needs. I knew exactly what she meant. Somewhere far away, out of sight, where she would not have to explain me to her friends or justify my presence to her husband. Behind them, in the glow of their living room, I saw my grandson dash across the carpet with a toy airplane, his laughter muffled by the glass. For one irrational moment, I wanted to call out to him just to hear my name on his lips. But I did not. I had already been told, without them needing to say it, that my presence here was unwelcome. The smell of roast beef and cinnamon drifted out into the cold, a cruel contrast to the emptiness settling in my stomach. I glanced down at the steps I had just climbed, each one crusted with ice, knowing they would be twice as treacherous on the way back down. "All right," I said finally, not because I agreed, but because I understood there was nothing else to say. Benjamin's smirk deepened as though my retreat confirmed some unspoken point in his favor. Lynn stepped back into the hallway, and the door closed between us with a finality that was almost a relief. The wind caught the edges of my coat as I turned away from the house, tugging at me like it wanted me to keep moving. Snow had already filled my footprints from the walk-up, erasing any sign I had ever been there. Each step down the drive was deliberate. Plant the crutch, shift my weight, drag my bad leg forward. The snow squeaked under my boots, the sound loud in the silence. By the time I reached the street, the yellow lights spilling from their windows had blurred into the snowfall, then vanished completely. When I turned the corner, I told myself not to look back. Looking back would make it harder to ignore the fact that my own daughter had left me standing in the cold like a stranger. The air burned in my lungs, the cold biting through my gloves and into my fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound carrying eerily in the frozen air. I kept my eyes on this path ahead, though there was little to see, just the dark outline of trees against a sky the color of steel. By the time I reached the main road, the pain in my hip was a steady pulse, but I kept moving. The cabin was miles away, and the thought of the long walk ahead might have daunted me once. Tonight, it simply matched the heaviness in my chest. Benjamin's words replayed in my mind with each crunch of snow under my boots. Not just the cruelty of them, but the casual way he delivered them, like stating the weather. Lynn's silence hurt more than anything. Words can cut deep, but silence, the kind that lets cruelty stand unchecked, carves wounds that do not close. I had thought coming here was about finding temporary shelter. I see now it was about something else entirely, a final confirmation of where I stood in my daughter's life. And as the snow swallowed the sound of my steps, I made myself a quiet promise. I would not knock on that door again. Not here. Not ever. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that I had learned long ago how to survive in the cold. And the cold, for all its cruelty, has one advantage. It preserves. It keeps things intact. Memories, words. The kind of hurt that given time turns into something else entirely, something solid, something that waits. When Lynn told me she was getting married, she had that glow in her eyes I had not seen since she was a little girl. She sat across from me at the small kitchen table in my cabin, a cup of tea in her hands, her voice quick and bright as she told me about Benjamin, how he made her laugh, how he talked about wanting a family, how he had big plans for their life together. I listened, my hands wrapped around my own mug, letting her finish before I asked the questions a mother cannot help but how does he manage with money? I said. Lynn's smile faltered just a touch. He's had some bad luck. Investments that didn't work out, but he's turning it around. I heard the rehearsed tone in her answer, the one people use when they are repeating something. They have been told enough times to believe it. I did not press her then, but the worry lodged itself somewhere under my ribs. 2 months later, she came back with a different kind of glow, an excited, hurried energy. As she spread glossy wedding brochures across my table, she talked about venues with crystal chandeliers, a 10-piece band, custom floral arrangements that would be flown in from out of state. She wanted to know if I could help them with the cost. Help? How? I asked. Benjamin had already joined her by then, leaning against the counter like he owned the place. We figured you could loan us some money, he said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. You don't have much to spend it on out here, right? It's not like that shack eats up your savings. I set my cup down. How much are you asking for? He named a number that made my stomach tighten. I knew what that kind of debt could do to a young marriage, especially when one partner was already in deep. No, I said, keeping my voice calm. I'm not putting that kind of money into a party. If you want to get married, you can do it simply. And you can do it without starting your life together in more debt than you can handle. Lynn's face went still. Benjamin smiled, but it was the wrong kind of smile. Tight, almost smug. So that's how it is, he said. The first time we ask you for anything, you turn us down. This isn't about turning you down, I told him. It's about protecting you both. A marriage is not built on a one-day spectacle. It's built on what you can manage day after day. He said nothing more to me that afternoon, but the look he gave me as they left was something I could not forget. A look that promised he would not let the matter rest. After that, I began to hear things. A cousin called awkward in her small talk before saying, I heard you don't approve of Benjamin, that you've never liked him. Another relative mentioned how people are saying, I refuse to contribute a dime to my daughter's happiness. The words were the same no matter who repeated them, too precise to be anything but rehearsed. By the time the wedding came around, a smaller affair than they had planned, Benjamin had laid the groundwork. I was the bitter mother who never thought any man was good enough for her daughter. I was stingy and obsessed with her shack. In his version of the story, my refusal to give them money was not about concern. It was about spite. The worst of it was overhearing him one evening at a family gathering, his voice carrying from the kitchen to the hall where I stood unseen. He was laughing with one of Lynn's uncles. She's got nothing, he said. Living out there like it's worth something when it's really not. The uncle chuckled along, and I felt the sting of the words more than I wanted to admit. I could have fought back. I could have called him out in front of the whole family, laid out the truth about his debts and his spending. The way he leaned on Lynn's paycheck while boasting about his business ventures, but I knew what would happen if I did. He would twist my words, make me the villain again, and Lynn would side with him. Love makes people blind, and she was still deep in that blindness. So, I said nothing. I let the gossip curl around me like smoke, choking, but invisible. I went back to my cabin, kept to myself, and carried on. The irony was that not long after the wedding, their first child, my grandson, fell ill. A respiratory infection, the doctor said, but severe enough to require a week in the hospital. I found out through a mutual friend, not from Lynn herself. The bills were high, and Benjamin's insurance was not as comprehensive as he had claimed. I called the hospital, settled the balance quietly, and asked the staff not to tell them who had paid. I never heard a thank you, and I never expected one, but I did hope that somewhere in some small way, they might realize there was more to me than the story Benjamin had been selling. That hope was wasted. A few months later at a barbecue, I watched Benjamin toss a beer can into the trash and smirk as he told a neighbor, she's a miser, sits on her pennies like they're gold bars, lives in that dump of hers like it's some kind of treasure. Truth is, she's just too proud to admit she's broke. I turned away before he saw me, my hands tightening around the paper plate I was holding. It was not pride that kept me in the cabin. It was history. It was the land my parents had worked, the walls my father had built with his own hands. It was the place I had chosen to keep, not because it was all I had, but because it was worth more to me than any number of glossy venues or showy gestures. Benjamin would never understand that. End of chapter 3. Recorded in August of 18. And Lynn, caught between the man she loved and the mother she once trusted, would not try. So I let him talk. I let him believe he had won whatever battle he thought he was fighting. I stayed silent, but I remembered every word. And if there is one thing I have learned about silence, it is that it is not empty. It waits. It holds on. It gathers its own kind of weight until the day comes when it is no longer silent at all, but something far more powerful. The cabin sits at the edge of a frozen lake, its roof heavy with snow for nearly 8 months of the year, the pines around it bending under the weight of winter. I have lived here most of my life, though it was not mine to begin with. My father built it in the summer of 1949, every plank cut by hand, every nail hammered in with care. My mother polished the wooden floors until they shone in the weak Alaskan sunlight, and she lined the shelves with jars of berries she picked herself. The walls hold their voices, even now, though they are quieter, fading like the photographs in the tin box under my bed. It is cold here, even in July, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you move slower, think longer. Some people would call it lonely, but I never did. I called it mine. Every creak of the floorboards was familiar. Every gust of wind against the windows, a part of the life I had chosen to keep. After Lynn married Benjamin, she came here less and less. The last time she visited with my grandson, he was still small enough to sleep in my arms. I knitted him a woolen hat with ear flaps that winter, the same pattern my mother once used for Lynn. I remember him smiling when I put it on his head, but Benjamin made a face and muttered something about old-fashioned junk. I pretended not to hear. From then on, I started sending gifts instead. Scarves, mittens, little toys carved from driftwood I found on the lakeshore. I thought it would be a way to stay connected, a quiet reminder that I was still here, still thinking of them. One January afternoon, the postal carrier handed me a box with my own handwriting on it. Inside were the mittens I had knitted for my grandson, still folded neatly, along with a sticky note in Lynn's handwriting. We don't take secondhand things secondhand. I sat there with the box in my lap, my breath clouding in the cold air. I had made those mittens myself from yarn I'd bought new in town, but to her, it was just another reminder of the life she had decided was beneath her. I did not send another gift after that. Life settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for feeding the wood stove, boiling coffee, and checking the traps I set near the lake. Afternoons were for mending things, clothes, fishing nets. The old quilt that had belonged to my mother. Nights were long, the kind of long that makes you count the hours until the sun will rise again. Sometimes I would think about selling the cabin, moving into town where there were neighbors within shouting distance, where I could buy groceries without driving 30 meters in the snow, but every time the thought came, it ran into the same wall. This cabin was more than wood and nails. It was the last thing my parents had put into my hands. Leaving it would feel like erasing them. Still, the winters grew harder. My hip ached in the mornings, my hands stiffened in the cold. The radio was my only regular voice from the outside world. I listened to news from far-off places while the snow fell outside, sometimes wondering if Lynn ever thought of me during her busy city days. It was during one of those endless winters that I decided to try something. I began telling anyone who asked, neighbors, the few relatives who still called, that the cabin was falling apart. I mentioned a leaky roof, mold in the walls, the kind of repairs I could never afford. I let my voice catch when I spoke about how cold it got inside when the wind came in through the gaps. I wanted to see who would offer to help, who would come check on me without being asked. Weeks passed. No one came. When I spoke to Lynn on the phone, a rare occurrence, she would rush through the conversation, mentioning how busy she was. "You should think about moving," she'd say, her tone brisk, as if the matter was simple. "It's not safe for you there anymore," but she never followed it with an invitation, never said, "Come stay with us." It struck me then the strange math of family, how they could be concerned enough to advise you to leave, but not enough to give you a place to go. The only visits I got were from the weather itself. Some mornings the fog rolled so thick across the lake I could barely see the treine. Other days, the sky was so clear I could count the stars long before nightfall. I learned to listen for the groan of the ice, the snap of a branch under the weight of snow. Out here, nature speaks more often than people do, and yet for all the silence I felt watched, not by eyes, but by memory. My mother's hands in the garden. My father bent over the workbench the way Lynn used to run down to the dock in summer, bare feet slapping the boards. Those ghosts kept me company in a way the living no longer did. By the time spring came and the snow began to melt into streams along the path, I had accepted that the cabin and I were alike. Too old to be taken seriously, too stubborn to be discarded. It was falling apart, so was I, and we would hold each other up for as long as we could. I did not yet know that all the years of being quietly pushed aside and spoken of with contempt were about to turn into something else entirely. But I did know this. When people show you how little they care, it is best to take them at their word, and I had started listening. The wind had been howling since before dawn, rattling the windows in their frames and sending sharp drafts through the tiniest gaps in the cabin walls. By mid-morning, the snow had piled knee-deep against the door, the sky outside, a white blur that erased the lake, the trees, even the path to the shed. The radio had gone silent hours earlier, replaced by a low hum that meant the power was out again. The wood pile by the stove was down to 3 logs, each one damp from the last thaw and slow to catch fire. I had been careful in the days leading up to the storm, checking the generator, stocking up on food, making sure I had enough kerosene. But no one can prepare for a storm like this, the kind they call once in a century, and mean it. The wind pressed against the walls as if it wanted to come inside and finish what the cold had started. My hands were numb even under my gloves, my breath clouding in front of me, though I stood inside. By late afternoon, I could feel the temperature dropping fast. I had eaten the last of the bread that morning, scraping the jar of jam clean, and there was only a handful of beans left in the pantry. The generator sputtered and died, taking the faint hum of the electric heater with it. The silence was deafening, broken only by the groan of ice on the lake and the sharp crack of a branch giving way under the weight of snow. I told myself I could make it through the night. I had done it before, but the truth was, my hip ached so badly I could barely move without bracing myself against the furniture, and my chest felt tight with every breath. The cold was not just in the room, it was in me. I thought of that day on their porch, the invitation Lynn had given me so quickly erased by Benjamin's contempt. Calling now felt like reopening an old wound, but the storm left me no choice. I stared at the old landline phone on the wall for a long time before lifting it from its cradle. My fingers were stiff, and it took 2 tries to dial Lynn's number. It rang 3 times before I heard her voice. "Hello," she said, her tone distracted as if she was doing something else while answering. "Lynn," I said, my voice catching. I'm out of firewood. The storm." I paused to swallow the tightness in my throat. "I am scared, sweetheart." There was a sound on the other end, muffled movement. And then Benjamin's voice cut in, sharp and unmistakable. "What's the problem now?" I hesitated, but answered anyway. "The power's out. I have no heat left." "I'm sick of this," he said, and his tone shifted to something darker. "Afraid you're going to freeze. Good. Maybe then you'll stop crawling back here every time you want attention. I told you once, you're not stepping foot in this house." For a moment I could not breathe. Not because of the cold, but because of the way his words landed. I had known cruelty before, but this was different. This was deliberate. I heard Lynn in the background saying something I could not make out. And then Benjamin again, louder this time. "She's fine. She always exaggerates. She's not our problem." I did not wait for more. My hand was steady as I put the receiver back in place, but inside something fragile had shifted. The warmth I had once kept for my daughter. The belief that she might still care had cracked, and the cold rushed in to fill it. The light outside was fading, the snow still falling in thick, relentless sheets. I moved slowly, feeding the last log into the stove and watching as the flames licked at it, reluctant and weak. I pulled the old quilt from the bed and wrapped it around myself, sinking into the armchair near the window. The wind screamed across the lake, and I could feel it in my bones. My breath was shallow, my feet numb, but it was not the cold that hurt most. It was the memory of Benjamin's voice, the contempt in it, and the knowledge that Lynn had let him speak for her. I sat there staring into the darkening room, and for the first time in my life, I felt the kind of stillness that has nothing to do with peace. It was the stillness of realizing you are truly alone, that no one is coming, and that the people you once thought would fight for you would rather see you fall. The storm raged on into the night, battering the walls, howling through the chimney. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me, cold and merciless, until it felt almost familiar. Out here in the silence between gusts, I understood something I had not before. Cold does not just kill, it teaches, and I was learning fast. The city was noisier than I remembered, its streets restless with traffic and voices even in the early afternoon. I had come unannounced, telling myself I only wanted to see Lynn, maybe surprise her with lunch, maybe bring her a jar of blueberry jam I had made at the end of summer. It was not much, but it was something from home, something that tasted of the lake in the woods where I still lived. I turned onto their street and slowed, recognizing the two-story house with the painted shutters and neat front yard. But before I could reach the driveway, I saw movement that made me stop. Benjamin was on the porch, his tall frame hunched forward as he hauled a heavy box and dumped it onto the sidewalk. Another box followed, then a garbage bag that ripped open when it hit the pavement, spilling a scatter of framed photographs and folded sweaters. At first, I thought it was Lynn's things. My chest tightened. But then I saw her standing off to the side, arms crossed, her face turned away as if she did not want to watch. And beside the pile of belongings stood a woman about my age, her coat thin against the wind, her hair swept back in a way that spoke more of habit than vanity. She looked stunned, her hands clutching the strap of a worn leather purse. "You are a leech," Benjamin's voice rang out, sharp enough to make two people walking past glance over. "I am not supporting you, and I am sure as hell not letting you freeload in my house. You should have thought about that before you decided to get old." The woman's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Benjamin grabbed another box from inside and threw it down onto the others. A porcelain lamp shattered, the pieces scattering like teeth across the concrete. "There," he said, brushing his hands together. "That should be all of it. Don't expect me to bring the rest." It was only then that I recognized her. Lexi, Benjamin's mother. We had spoken only briefly at the wedding, polite pleasantries between strangers. I stepped closer. "Lexi?" I asked, my voice low. Her eyes flicked to mine, startled, and for a moment she looked as though she might cry, but she straightened instead, forcing her chin up. "Rosie," she said softly. Benjamin looked over his shoulder, his expression souring. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see Lynn," I said, keeping my tone even. He snorted. "Well, you can see that we are busy, unless you came to take this lot off my hands too." He gestured at Lex's belongings with a flick of his hand, as if they were trash. "I will take her," I said, "and I will take her things." Lex's eyes widened, but Benjamin just smirked. "Be my guest. One less problem for me." He turned back into the house without another word. Lynn followed him inside, not looking at either of us. The door closed behind them. The wind caught at Lex's coat, making her shiver. I stepped forward and took her arm. "Come on," I said. "Let's get out of the cold." We carried what we could between us, leaving the rest in a stack to retrieve later, and made our way to the small cafe at the corner. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of coffee and fresh bread. We found a table in the back, away from the windows. For a while, she just wrapped her hands around the mug the waitress brought her, letting the heat seep into her fingers. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but the words came slow. "I gave him that house," she said. "Signed it over to him and Lynn 2 years ago. He said it would make them more secure, help them start their life together without worrying about a mortgage. There was one condition. He wanted me to move in until I could get a place of my own. He told me it would be nice to have me there while they got settled." She took a sip of coffee, her eyes on the table. "I should have known. The papers were barely signed when things changed. He didn't like the way I cooked, said I took up too much space, told me I was in the way. And last night he said he couldn't stand to look at me anymore, that he could not handle old people." I thought of the way he had spoken to me. The way he had looked at me like something inconvenient that had to be removed. Hearing it from his own mother was no surprise, but it still lodged in me like a splinter. He told me to pack, Lexi continued. When I said I needed time, he started throwing my things out himself. And today, well, you saw the rest. We sat in silence for a moment, the clink of cups and low hum of conversation around us. I am sorry, I said finally. I am sorry he did that to you. And I am sorry you had to find out who he really is this way. She looked up then, meeting my eyes. You know, she said, he always told me you did not like him, that you were difficult. I believed him because he is my son, but seeing you here helping me, I think maybe I should have listened with my own ears instead of his. Something in her voice felt like an opening, a bridge between two women who had been pushed to the same edge by the same man. We stayed there for another hour talking. Not just about Benjamin, but about the lives we had before him. Her years working at the post office, my summers tending the garden by the lake. The more we spoke, the more I felt the weight of the isolation I had been carrying, and the more I realized she carried it too. By the time we left, the wind had eased and the sky had cleared just enough for the sun to break through. We gathered the rest of her things from the sidewalk in silence, but it was not an empty silence. It was the kind that comes when two people understand something without having to say it. From that day on, Lexi and I became friends. Two women of the same age, both left behind by the people we had loved most, both learning that being discarded did not mean we were finished. In a world that had decided we were too old to matter, we would matter to each other. It began with a knock on my cabin door one brisk morning in early autumn. The kind of morning when the frost clung stubbornly to the grass and the lake lay still under a thin veil of mist. Two men stood outside, bundled in parkas, their breath clouding in the air. They introduced themselves as surveyors from a mining company. At first, I thought they had the wrong place. One of them, a younger man with a clipboard tucked under his arm, explained that their team had been doing geological studies in the area. There had been whispers for years about mineral deposits in the region, but now they had proof. Beneath my land, beneath the worn cabin floor and the pines that had stood longer than I'd been alive, lay one of the richest veins of silver they had ever charted. We'd like to make an offer, the older man said, his voice smooth, professional. $137 million for the mining rights. The land remains yours, but we operate beneath it. For a long moment, I just stood there, my hand resting on the edge of the door. A figure like that didn't feel real. It was the kind of number people mentioned in business magazines or lottery headlines. I could feel my heart beating in my ears, but I didn't let the shock show. Instead, I frowned, tilted my head slightly and said, "That's a lot of noise you're talking about bringing under my home." I asked about the environmental impact, about how long it would take, about how often they'd be around. I made them think I was hesitant, that I might not be the kind of woman to sign away such a thing without weeks of deliberation. Inside, my mind was already working faster than it had in years. I told them I'd think about it, and they left their cards. When the door closed, I sat at the kitchen table, tracing the numbers on the brochure with my finger. I thought about the years I'd been told my home was worth nothing, about the words rotting shack and rusty nails, and how they'd been thrown at me like weapons. And I thought about what I could do with $137 million, not for them, but for me, for the life I had left. A week later, before I signed the contract, I received an invitation, handwritten by Lynn, to my grandson's 7th birthday. It was the first time in years she'd asked me to come to something at their house. The invitation didn't erase anything, but it did make me curious. I decided to go. The house was full of people when I arrived, the kind of noise that comes with too many bodies in one space. Laughter, the clatter of dishes, the high pitch of children's voices. Lynn greeted me politely, almost formally, and steered me toward the living room, where the gifts were piled high on a table. I had brought something that, to me, was priceless. My mother's sewing machine. It was an old Singer, black and gold, with delicate floral patterns etched into its surface. My mother had used it to make my clothes when I was a girl, to sew quilts in the long winters, to mend my father's shirts when money was tight. It was the kind of heirloom meant to be passed down, a piece of our history that could keep giving if someone cared for it. I set it on the table with the other presents. Some of the parents glanced at it, curious, but most went back to their conversations. When the time came for my grandson to open gifts, Benjamin hovered beside him, making comments as the paper was torn away from boxes of toys and gadgets. When the sewing machine was unwrapped, the room went quieter for a moment. My grandson looked at it with the blank curiosity of a child who has no context for such a thing. Benjamin, however, let out a laugh that drew more eyes. "Take it home and sew your tent," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Take it back and use it to patch that shack of yours." A ripple of awkward laughter moved through the room. Lynn looked down at her lap. I felt the heat rise in my face, but I did not let it touch my expression. Instead, I smiled, small, polite, almost dismissive, and said nothing. I reached over, brushed a speck of dust from the machine surface, and let my hand linger there for a second longer than necessary. I wanted him to think I had not heard the insult, or that I had decided it was beneath me to respond. But inside, the plan that had begun with the mining company's offer grew sharper. The sewing machine was not a random choice. I had brought it knowing exactly how Benjamin would react. I wanted to see if he was still as predictable as ever. I wanted to remind myself in the face of all the noise and all the people who thought they knew me, that silence is not weakness. Silence is waiting. That evening, when I returned to the cabin, I placed the mining contract on the table. I read every line twice, signed my name with a steady hand, and called the surveyors to tell them they had a deal. Benjamin's laughter at that birthday party would be the last thing I allowed him to take from me without consequence. He thought my life could be summed up in the image of a rundown shack and a few rusty nails. Soon he would understand that what lay beneath, like the silver under my land, was something he had never bothered to see, and something far more powerful than he could imagine. The transfer went through faster than I expected. One morning, a courier in a navy parka arrived with a slim envelope, the kind that does not need to be heavy to change your life. Inside was the official confirmation from the mining company. My account had been credited with the full sum for the rights, $137 million. I set the paper down on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. The cabin strangely silent around me. All those years of hearing that my home was worth nothing, that my life was worth even less, and here it was. Proof that both statements had always been lies. I did not run to a dealership to buy a shiny car or call a realtor for a mansion. My first call was to a discreet investment manager a friend in town had once recommended. I told him exactly what I wanted, a network of shell companies, each registered to someone else, each with a different name, but all working toward the same goal. Within 3 months, those companies owned every vacant lot, every foreclosed house, and every piece of undeveloped land in a 3-slot radius around Lynn and Benjamin's home. I studied the property maps late into the night, tracing the neat rectangles of ownership until theirs was the only parcel untouched. It sat there like an island surrounded by water I now controlled. When the time was right, I would drain that water and watch the island sink. Lexi was the only person I told, and even then I did not give her every detail. She had moved into a small apartment nearby with the few things Benjamin had not destroyed, and we met often for coffee. One morning, over steaming mugs, she told me something that made my jaw tighten. "Do you remember when I had that bruise on my cheek at the wedding?" she asked. I nodded slowly. I had assumed it was an accident she did not want to talk about. "It wasn't," she said. "Benjamin has always had a temper. I thought maybe he'd change with Lynn, but he didn't. He just got better at hiding it." That night, I could not sleep. The image of my daughter, silent at the birthday party, eyes downcast while Benjamin mocked me, shifted into something darker. What else had she kept her head down for? The next day, Lexi and I visited a law office downtown. The attorney was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who listened without interrupting as Lexi recounted what she knew, and I added what I suspected. She tapped her pen against her legal pad, then said, "If there's a pattern, we can find it. And if he's crossed the line into criminal assault, we can act." It took 6 weeks. The lawyer's investigators spoke to neighbors, co-workers, anyone who might have seen or heard something. Medical records were obtained, photos of injuries reviewed. It all painted a picture I had dreaded but expected. Benjamin had not just shouted at Lynn, he had put her in the hospital twice. Once for a fall down the stairs that the attending physician had noted was inconsistent with the injuries, and once for a broken wrist she claimed happened when she slipped on ice. The evidence was enough. One crisp morning, while Benjamin was on his way to his car, 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of their house. I was not there, but Lexi was. She said he looked more annoyed than scared as the officers cuffed him, as if this was just an inconvenience he could talk his way out of. Lynn stood on the porch, pale and silent, watching her husband being read his rights. The charges were serious: felony domestic assault, intimidation, and obstruction for lying to officers during prior incidents. He was taken into custody and held without bail pending trial. For a moment, I thought this might be enough. He was out of her life for now, and the net I'd been weaving around their home was nearly complete. But the truth was, this wasn't only about punishment, it was about balance. Years of insult, of being pushed aside, of watching him strip dignity from everyone around him had tipped the scales. I wanted them even again. That night, I sat with Lexi in her kitchen, the hum of her refrigerator filling the pauses in our conversation. She looked at me over the rim of her teacup and said, "You're not finished, are you?" "No," I said. "Not yet." I thought of Benjamin in a cold cell, still believing he could talk his way out of anything. I thought of the look on his face when the notice would come informing them that their street, his precious territory, was slated for redevelopment, that the companies buying up everything had not been strangers at all, that the woman he called worthless had been behind it from the start, and for the first time in years, I felt warm. Not from the heat of a stove or the layers of blankets on my bed, but from the quiet certainty that this was no longer a story about loss. It was becoming a story about return, about taking back every inch of ground I'd been forced to give. The night Benjamin came for us was so still it felt unnatural, as if the whole forest outside had stopped breathing. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, each one catching in the amber glow of the porch light I'd forgotten to turn off. It was close to midnight. Lexi had gone to bed early with a headache. I was in the kitchen cradling a mug of chamomile tea, reading under the small lamp above the counter. That's when I heard it. A crunching step on frozen snow. Too heavy, too purposeful to be an animal. I moved the window and eased the curtain back just enough to see. A shadow detached itself from the tree. Even before he stepped into the light, I knew the way he moved. Shoulders forward, stride full of intent. Benjamin. My stomach turned to ice. The news had said he was still in custody, awaiting trial. Clearly, that wasn't true anymore. I backed away from the window, my mind ticking through what I could do. The lock on the door was strong, but it wouldn't last long against a determined man, and Benjamin was nothing if not determined when he thought someone had crossed him. There was no knock, just the sharp, brittle sound of glass shattering in the mudroom, followed by the heavy thud of boots on the floor. I reached for the phone, thumb hovering over the keys, but before I could dial, he was in the kitchen doorway. The knife in his hand caught the lamplight, gleaming cold and sharp. His eyes were wild, his breath short, a thin layer of sweat on his forehead despite the freezing air. "You," he spat, his voice low and shaking with fury. "You ruined my life, both of you." Lexi appeared at the end of the hallway, her face pale. His gaze slid to her and his mouth twisted into a sneer. "You think you're safe here? You think she—" He jabbed the knife in my direction. "Can protect you? You're both leeches and leeches get cut out." Before I could move, another figure stepped in. Lynn. I hadn't even heard her arrive earlier. She planted herself between Benjamin and us, her hands raised, her voice soft but steady. "Ben," she said almost gently, "you don't want to do this." "The hell I don't," he snarled. "If you put the knife down," she continued, "we can talk, we can figure this out, I'll come back, we can start over, just put it down." Her left hand slipped into her coat pocket, fingers pressing against her phone. I knew that motion well enough to recognize it. She was calling 911 without looking. Benjamin's grip on the knife shifted. "You're lying." "I'm not," she said, her tone level, "but I can't talk to you while you're holding that thing. We can't fix anything like this." She kept talking, stringing words together, her voice filling the space while the minutes crawled by. I could hear the faintest sound from outside, the crunch of tires over snow, doors opening, boots hitting the porch steps. "Ben," Lynn said suddenly, her voice sharper, "look at me." He did, and that was when the kitchen door burst open. Two officers rushed in. One grabbed his knife arm, the other shoved him hard against the counter. He fought, twisting, shoving back, but more boots thundered in behind them. Within seconds, he was face down on the floor, hands cuffed, his breath ragged with rage. This time, the list of charges was longer. Felony domestic violence, unlawful entry, attempted assault with a deadly weapon, resisting arrest, no bail, no more waiting for trial from the comfort of home. They dragged him out into the snow. I watched his face when the reality sank in. Not just that the night was over, but that everything was over. His grip on Lynn, his control over Lexi, the smug way he'd always believed I was powerless. It was all gone. Inside, the three of us stood in the kitchen, adrenaline still humming. Lynn turned to me, her eyes wet. "Mom, I was wrong," she whispered. "I want to start over, if you'll let me." I didn't answer then. The wound was still too fresh. I simply nodded and went to check on Lexi. It was a week later when Lexi caught a bad cold that I found my answer. I walked into the bedroom to see Lynn sitting at her bedside laying a cool cloth on her forehead, murmuring something as she adjusted the blankets. There was no impatience in her face. No hurry, only care. I stepped closer, laid my hand on her shoulder. She looked up, and I pulled her into an embrace. "It's never too late to start again," I told her. That spring, the three of us, me, Lynn, and Lexi, moved into a bigger house on the edge of town. The mornings filled with sunlight through wide windows, the afternoons with the smell of bread baking, the nights with the murmur of voices around the table. Being abandoned doesn't mean you're alone. Sometimes it just means you were waiting to find the right people. And when you do, that's when you finally have a family. And that's my story. Not a tale of revenge served in anger, but one served in patience, silence, and truth. The kind of justice that doesn't shout. It simply arrives undeniable and final. If you've been through something like this, if you've ever been underestimated, pushed aside, or told you don't matter, remember your worth is not for them to decide. Time has a way of proving the quiet ones right. I've lived long enough to know that the best endings aren't always loud. Sometimes they're just peaceful mornings in a home full of love with the right people by your side.